Hello and welcome to Sustain. On episode number 249, our recent episode with Jen Turner, the name Nolan Lawson came up. Thank you, Jen, for reminding me. Back in the days of 2020, when everything was a bit hectic, I did not have the same processes that I have in place now to ensure that this podcast runs well, which means that we had a recording with Nolan that was never actually published. So I am incredibly grateful for her for bringing that up. And I'm incredibly grateful for Nolan saying it's okay to publish it now. So fresh from the archives that you've never seen before, I hope you enjoy this evergreen conversation with Nolan Lawson. Let's go. Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source in the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Can I just give up this project? I don't want to be on this project anymore. Today we have a couple of panelists. We have Justin Dorfman.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
Eric Berry.
Hey, everybody.
Me, obviously. That's always a given if I'm talking. And our guest today is a really awesome guest. He was the maintainer of PouchDB from 2013 to 2017. He now works for Salesforce in Seattle, talking to Nolan Lawson. How are you doing, Nolan?
I'm doing good. How are you all doing?
Excellent. So can you tell us a bit about how you got involved as the maintainer of PouchDB and where that led you? Because I know there's a larger story and I want to get right into it.
So I got involved with the PouchDB project around 2013, 2014. And just a minor correction, I was a maintainer. It was always kind of a collaborative effort. There were multiple people working on the project. The primary core maintainer was, and I think still is, Dale Harvey from Mozilla. There were plenty of people who were maintaining the project at the time. But I got involved in 2013, 2014, mostly out of an interest in databases and how they work in the browser. So for those who don't know, PouchDB is basically a CouchDB implementation in JavaScript that runs in the browser or in Node.js. And at the time, I was using it for just kind of a small hobby project, actually something that doesn't even exist today, no one's ever heard of, but just kind of fell in love with this little database. And I was just fascinated with getting it to work in as many environments as possible, learning all the little different browser quirks in IndexeDB and Web SQL and local storage and the 10,000 different ways of storing data in the browser. And to me, all those things are just fascinating. I actually love browser differences. I love sussing all those things out. So I got involved just writing a lot of tests and fixing a lot of bugs. And before I know it, I was just basically contributing to the thing full time in my spare time anyway.
I think I got involved, or at least started seeing your name around the internet. I was building a Firefox and Chrome extension that was a PDF annotator, and I needed a really tight little DB to use. And PouchDB made a lot of sense because it could run in the browser, or it could use it in an extension, and it was really useful. And so that's where I started seeing you. And you were really responsive. I had a lot of questions. I didn't know what I was doing. And you were pretty much always, oh yeah, there's Nolan again. Thank you so much. You wrote a post in 2017 called What It's Like to Be an Open Source Maintainer, where you talk a bit about what the experience was of being always there. Can you tell us a bit about that post?
Yeah, sure. So that post I wrote around, I think it was early 2017. So I'd been working on PouchDB for about, I guess, 3-4 years at this point. And in retrospect, it was really a post about burnout, although I was probably not being honest with myself at the time about what I was doing, why I was writing it. But essentially what I say in the post is that I describe what it's like to be an open source maintainer. I kind of describe like the emotional labor of you go to your GitHub notifications and you've got 20 or 30 issues or pull requests to look at. And each one requires your attention. You got to go through and read maybe multiple paragraphs that someone has written. Maybe they haven't described their bug very well. Or maybe it's a very well-meaning pull request, but it's very complicated. So it takes a ton of your time. And you sort of have this like constant stream of negativity about your projects. It's always something you did wrong. But nobody opens an issue to say, your project is great. And I've been completely successful and empowered because of it. And everything is wonderful. And thank you so much. It's never that. It's always, well, we ran into this little problem, blah, blah, blah. So it's just very taxing to be dealing with this all the time. And in effect, what I wrote was kind of a cry for help. It was a very personal blog post. I was kind of hesitant to write it at the time. I wrote it basically in a day. I remember it was a weekend. It was like Saturday or Sunday. And I just sat down and just poured out of me. And I didn't ask anyone to review it before I put it out. I just kind of published it. And what I was really surprised about was just the response that I got from other open source maintainers saying, you hit the nail on the head. This is exactly how I feel. I had people reaching out to me publicly, privately even. Some well-known open source maintainers reaching out to me privately saying, I totally identify with this, but it's so hard to say in public. And so that made me feel really good. And at the same time, I think it was good for me to write it because at that time I was sort of going through, let's say, like a breakup with PouchDB, where nowadays I don't work on the project anymore. I'm not a maintainer. Shortly after I wrote that post, I moved on to other projects and I kind of stopped contributing to PouchDB full time.
I remember that day. Like, it was a shot heard around the world. It was like #1 on HN, your blog post, and it was just really making its rounds on Twitter and everything. So I just remember reading that and I was like, yeah, this is what a lot of maintainers go through, including myself. And it was just easy to relate to it. And it's interesting because the Beatles were interviewed a few times saying, how long did it take you to write that song? Most of their songs are #1 hits. They're like, John and I cranked that out in about 5 minutes. It's usually those real quick ones that are actually the ones that make the biggest impact. So I'm really glad you said that because it could inspire someone that might be frustrated with something and just go ahead and say, hey, I'm just going to put it out there. I don't need peer review. I don't need anything. I just want to get it out there. So I think what the lesson is here is, if you're feeling crappy, just put it out there and it'll attract a lot of people that might be going through the same thing. So I just remember reading that because as a maintainer myself, sorry to keep repeating myself, but I was just like, oh my God, I get exactly what this guy's talking about because I didn't know you at the time. So.
Well, Nolan, and I guess Justin as well, what's the reason to stay involved? It sounds like it's a very bleak picture with very little benefit. Why would you continue to maintain when it's a thankless job?
The post is kind of intensely negative and it sounds like it is bleak, as you say. Maybe that's just the way that I tend to write. I tend to write about problems rather than solutions. It's what I naturally find interesting. But I think there's actually a good quote from a recent book by Nadia Egbald. So she wrote this book, Working in Public, that I'm probably going to make a lot of references to in this podcast. Yes, yeah, I have my coffee too, because it's a fantastic book. She actually quotes my blog post in the book briefly, but mostly she draws so many different threads together. And I think she really does a good job of explaining at least what I was going through. So there's this paragraph in the first chapter where she says, the cycle looks something like this. Open source developers write and publish their code in public. They enjoy months, maybe years in the spotlight, but eventually popularity offers diminishing returns. If the value of maintaining code fails to outpace the rewards, many of these developers quietly retreat to the shadows. So I strongly identify with that. Even if I wouldn't say I'm exactly in the shadows now, like I don't work on such high profile open source projects anymore, but I do work on open source projects. But to answer your question, she says it right there. You enjoy many years in the spotlight. You enjoy, I think what she calls reputational benefits are one huge benefit. So let me just paint a picture for you of what I was doing right before I wrote that post. So around 2015, 2016, I was actively working on this project, many other projects as well. I was speaking at tons of conferences and meetups. If you were in the New York area around the time, you probably knew me as the guy who was the first person to speak at all 4 local, what were called Boro.js meetups. I spoke at Brooklyn.js, Manhattan.js, Jersey Script, Queens.js. I think I spoke twice at Queens.js. I did a different talk.
Jersey's not New York. I'm sorry, Jersey's not New York. Anyway, moving on.
I think New Yorkers might argue with you about that, but debatable. Let's not get into Staten Island either. So basically, the picture I'm trying to paint for you is someone who's just firing on all cylinders, not only working on open source in their spare time, but also going out to meetups, to conferences, writing conference talks. I think in 2016, I think I spoke at about 10 different conferences, maybe close to 10 in different places around the country and the world. I was essentially on a path towards burnout. But as I was doing so, I was accruing all these reputational benefits. People got to know me. I was getting more and more Twitter followers. Like, hey, I'm getting all this attention. People are really interested in what I have to say. And they're talking about every blog post I write, every tweet I write. There's kind of this whole ecosystem that can grow around open source. I'm not saying every open source maintainer has this exact same experience, but it can almost be like being a social media influencer. You can kind of get drunk on this reputation or fame or whatever you want to call it. And she actually calls that out in the book as well, Nadia Egbald. It's the parallels with other social media platforms.
Eric, you asked me the same question. It becomes your identity, especially like I'm in my 8th year of a project and I'm finally giving over the reins. But as Nolan says, like, you rub shoulders with really influential people in the industry. And I don't want to get kicked out of the GitHub organization. So I got to keep going. That's how bad it gets. And for me, I got to the point where I get an email every time the Bootstrap CDN has a little bit amount of downtime. One day I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I need to move on to the next thing. And I love what we're building here at Sustain. And I just want to put more energy towards that and not debug, open up curl or MTR and run trace routes and all that other stuff. So yeah, I totally get where you're coming from.
So at what point did you get to where you realized that the benefits were diminishing and not really worth it anymore? And what was the process that you went through to go from, I'm going to be a maintainer, to maybe I shouldn't do this anymore?
I think a lot of things were changing in my personal life around 2017 that sort of helped put things into focus for me. So I moved out of New York. I started a new relationship, then girlfriend, now wife. And one of the things I draw out in the post is I said, I don't understand how I could do what I'm doing in open source and also start a family, for instance. Essentially, I had no hobbies other than open source. When I was most prolific, I was single. I was living in New York. Typical Saturday or Sunday for me was just working on open source from morning until evening, basically. And then doing that every single weeknight. So when I moved away from the New York area, I think it kind of gave me an opportunity. I moved to Seattle. It gave me an opportunity to sort of reflect on what I was doing with my life. I had a partner. She was very patient. I got to bounce ideas off of her. And I started to think more about, should I be spending time with my family? Should I be spending time with this relationship? Should I have some hobbies where I'm actually going outside and doing something other than being in front of a screen 24 hours a day? So the post for me, I think, was it was a way of giving myself license to say I'm done. Because I didn't feel like I could just walk away from the project. It was too scary. It made me feel too guilty. I didn't want to just ghost. I knew that was a thing that some open source maintainers do, or at least I'd gotten that impression that's what they do. There were many projects that I'd seen where there had been some maintainer who was working on it very actively for years and years. You'd see tons of posts about it on their blog, and then there would just be kind of radio silence for years after that, and the project wouldn't really have any contributions. And I didn't want that to be me. It felt like death. I don't want to maybe make it sound too dramatic. That's kind of how it felt like to me. Whereas if I could express what I was going through, if I could kind of give voice to this feeling of burnout, then I felt like maybe I could get something good out of this experience. And so by the time I wrote the post and I got the really positive feedback, in particular, I got pieces of feedback from two other people who had contributed to the PouchDB project, were members of the PouchDB ecosystem, Jan Leonard and Michael Rogers. And they both gave me two very different pieces of advice. They wrote these blog posts themselves, which I've linked to in my blog post, where essentially what Michael said was, he said, it's time to leave. Like, when you're starting to feel this way, it's time to leave your project. And he said, you're worried that if you do so, that no one's going to be there to fill in for you. All the work you've been doing, maybe answering questions on Stack Overflow, being active in the chat, fixing these bugs, you think that you're just going to leave this void, but actually by leaving that vacuum, you allow room for other people to come in and fill that space in the project. So it's actually, in some ways, it can be the best thing you can do for the project. That's what Michael said. And then Jan kind of took a more kind of middle road approach. He said, you just have to stop being so emotionally invested. You have to kind of stop caring, as he said. All these people in the world have all these problems with the software that you've written. But you know what? That's not your problem. You don't have to make it your problem. You don't have to be so emotionally invested in every single little GitHub issue that gets filed. But ultimately, I told myself I was going to do Jan's approach, but I ended up taking Michael's approach.
By the way, thank you for explaining that. It's such a fascinating topic. A whole bunch of questions are coming to me. I guess one of them is, do you think that maintaining open source requires a certain type of personality?
I think maybe maintaining a certain type of open source in a certain type of way requires a certain personality. I think that paid open source is very different from unpaid open source, maybe corporate versus hobbyist. For me, it was always hobbyist, basically, or at least these projects I was very deeply involved in were always hobbyist. Yeah, I think definitely it probably takes a certain kind of personality. There has to be some benefit that you're getting out of it. Either it's these reputational benefits, like I was accruing in terms of GitHub stars, Twitter followers, accolades at conferences, whatever it is, however you might measure that. For other people, I think they are just purely interested in the technology. I think there are definitely people who they don't necessarily go and talk at every conference and every meetup and want to go and rub shoulders with other developers. They love the problem space that they're in and they want to keep solving those problems and doing it in public. I think those people exist too. Speaking from my own experience, I was definitely more in the first camp than in the second camp.
I think you sort of semi-apologized earlier for saying it was personal, but I think a lot of open source is personal. All of it is. There's no maintainer out there who's a robot. And if they are, they're like Gitbot and no one likes that person. So for every single maintainer, there's this inner struggle of like, how much am I invested in the project? What's going on with people who, on one hand, desire my attention, and the other hand, give me attention? How can I balance these out and make it work? I think what you mentioned around, well, I realized I needed other hobbies and I was trying to build a family, is really pertinent to a lot of people in open source, because it's incredibly difficult to do open source when you're not paid. It just takes up a lot of time, and it's like an always on mentality. And it's really difficult to have the privilege to be able to do it, to have the time and effort that you can take your weekends and do that, and you don't need to work a second job, or you don't have kids to take care of. So I think a lot of open source people strike me as, frankly, white men in their 20s in cities. It's not good. It's a really interesting phenomenon. And so I think you're right when you mention that paid open source is different, because I think paid is slightly skews towards older, hopefully is more diverse. Open source has a big diversity problem. There's 4 dudes on this podcast, and all of us at least pass as white. And I'm sorry for that, listeners. But I really appreciate what you share about being vulnerable. And I also really like Michael's post and Jan's post. There's been a suite of posts since where people often feel the need to get off their chest. There's been too much expectations on me. I haven't said what I need the most or enough. And so I'm saying all this now, and now I'm going to go away for a bit. Do you feel like that's a natural progression for most open source maintainers? Do you think that there's ways to mitigate that sort of emotional buildup?
I'm sure it's a common experience. And you're totally right, by the way, in calling me out or calling out the open source in general. Like this was another reason that I felt a little bit uncomfortable writing the post, is because it really felt like I was sort of complaining from a position of privilege, right? Like I said, in my most prolific, like I was, a single white hetero guy living in the city, and I didn't have family to take care of. I didn't really have any obligations like that. And so that was something that empowered me to spend every weeknight and every weekend working on this stuff. And it probably helped catapult my career. And so it was a huge privilege to be able to work on open source. So that made me feel a little guilty even about even complaining about things, which is another thing that people told me they absolutely identified with in the piece, was that they felt like they couldn't even really talk about this stuff because it just felt like, oh, here's another guy who's so privileged and whining about his privilege. But I think you can have empathy for anyone. And even if I was complaining about a hole that I dug myself into, I think it's okay to talk about that. It's just mental health issues or personal health, whatever you want to call it. I think it's totally valid. And I definitely think that lots of different open source maintainers have this kind of experience, at least in terms of just this cycle that, Nadia talks about. She calls it a cycle, says it's very common. I definitely went through it. I see others who have gone through it as well. It might be a natural progression of getting too invested in a project, thinking that you are the keystone that is going to make this project succeed or fail. And that if I'm gone, then it's all over after that. If you build up those expectations like that, then you really put yourself in a situation where you can't ever dig yourself out of that hole unless you just completely give up, which I think was ultimately what I had to do. Although I didn't completely give up, I did do some responsible things. Like I took all of my PouchDB plugins and I moved them to a separate GitHub organization. I reached out to other maintainers in the project and said, hey, I'm going to make you an admin on this. I tried to do my due diligence. I told people in IRC, like, hey, I'm probably just going to not be super active for a while. And like I said before, it almost felt like a breakup. It was kind of like a way of saying goodbye. It's strange, but even today, like I saw PouchDB on the front page of Hacker News, and it almost felt like scrolling through Facebook and you see a photo of your ex or something. It kind of like hit me in the heart.
That's so funny. Not funny, but I totally get what you're saying. It's crazy.
I've had that recently too. I was let go, unsubscribed, kicked out, whatever you want to call it, from the IPFS organization on GitHub. And I don't know if you've ever been let go from an organization. There's just no sugar on the frosting ever. You just get an email one day, you wake up, you are no longer in this organization. And for me, like IPFS was my life for 3 years. Every single day, I still have the t-shirts. And now I'm like, do I wear those? Yeah, it was a really valuable part and I love the team, but it's not me anymore. What do I do? Oh no. So I feel you on that.
Yeah, I got kicked out of the Twitter engineering GitHub org, and I was like, how dare they?
Devastating. Just devastating.
I was like, fine, I don't want to be in your stupid organization. Screw you, man.
Which is why I really like the approach that you've done. And I've seen other people do this well. Titus has done this really well. Titus Warmer, we've had him on the podcast. He does Remark, where you basically take all your modules and say, you know what? I can't deal with this crap. And then open a GitHub work and just throw them all in there and then try to figure out who else can maintain, who can I cultivate into a maintainer if possible.
Yeah. Although, to be honest, I can't tell you how successful that strategy has been. I hope it has been. But in the same way that sometimes your heart just can't take it when you go and look at the Facebook page of an ex, I can't even go and see what's going on with PouchDB these days. I haven't even looked at the community in years. It pains me too much too. It's a really strange thing to admit, but that's honestly the way I feel.
I empathize with that very much. And I know we're kind of joking about it a little bit, but the gravity of what you're saying, and it's so interesting to me to see someone who's given so much of their life to a project need to move on for your own personal health and mental health and for your family. And I could only imagine, for example, I've worked with companies that I've had to leave that they've continued to thrive. And I look back and it's bittersweet. It's bitter because I'm no longer part of it, but it's sweet because those that I really cared for are succeeding. And that's really the goal. But let me just say officially, thank you for all of your hard work that you've done on that project. And thank you for being a voice that others haven't been able to share. I can only imagine what it's like to have that type of responsibility and wake up in the morning. And on your post, you show an image of how many open issues do you have? Well, I've got 400. That's really scary and daunting. You'll never climb out of that. Or at least it's very difficult to climb out of that without just going through and just zapping them out, clearing the cache.
Or you're gone. Or you're gone.
Yeah. What was it like after you left and after you decided, okay, I'm stepping away? What did that do for you?
Well, I can honestly say that right now I feel a lot better than I did at the time. And I think that I have a healthier relationship with open source today than I did 3 or 4 years ago. I do still maintain some open source projects. For the most part, though, I don't go and speak at conferences or meetups. I've spoken at one online meetup this year. I think last year, I don't think I spoke at any. I spent more time finding some other hobbies. I got really into biking. So I spend a lot of time biking now, doing stuff outdoors away from a screen. I'm spending more time with my partner and with my family here in the Seattle area. I do open source, but I try not to let it consume my life. And I try not to feel like if someone has filed an issue, I need to respond right away, or that I need to go and answer every single question everywhere. So another thing I did that might be familiar to a lot of open source maintainers, Sean Larkin actually talks about this, a maintainer of Webpack. He talks about this in Nadia's book, that he would just go on Twitter and search for Webpack and then answer people's questions. And I think that Henry Zhu of Babel might have said he did the same thing. I can't recall. Anyway, I definitely did that. I would go and search Stack Overflow. I'd search Twitter. I'd search Google. Anyone who's talking about the project anywhere, I wanted to go and help them right now. I wanted to be the guy. I wanted to swoop in like Batman, like the bat signal just went up and I'm going to go in and save the day. And I don't do any of that anymore. I try to avoid looking at what people are saying about my project. People email me all the time. I've maintained many open source projects over the years. I used to write a lot of Android apps, and I still get emails today about stuff that I haven't worked on in almost a decade. And I just don't even reply a lot of the time. And that might seem kind of callous. And my past self would probably look at me and say, I'm definitely not Batman anymore. Am I the villain now? I don't know. But I'm finding more time and space for myself. And I think that my mental health and my personal relationships have definitely improved a lot since then.
I have a friend who I won't name, but he has a browser extension. It's like an open source project, and he has a support email. And it just goes into a hole, and he's never checked that email. I don't even think he has the password. And,
awesome.
He has 2 kids, and he's one of the most chill, peaceful guys I know. He's just super not worried about stuff because it's open source. He's like, it's not my job to support this. I made it because I wanted to, and that's it. I'm done. So I totally get the sense of relief when you decide to stop letting the expectation that you have to help someone be the primary mover for your actions. I also get wanting to go outside more. What I found is that the more I've gone outside, the more I want to use open source to help me get outside more. So I wouldn't be surprised if you find yourself on like OpenStreetMaps trying to fix their bike maps in like Seattle area so you can have like better biking opportunities. That's exactly what happened to me with birding. I'm using open source now to help my outdoor activities, which I think was the point in the beginning, right? You want to do stuff that makes you feel good. And so finding out what your passion is and then following that instead of sticking to something because it's what you've done and it's what you're known for and it's what you get praised for, even though you don't like it, just makes a lot more sense to do the former.
What you just said there is, I think that's a really good way of knowing whether it might be time for you to leave a project or not, is if you're not actually using the project for anything. Like I mentioned, I'd started off using the project because another side project of mine, I was really interested in solving a certain class of problems. And then neither of those things were true by 2017. And so I was just maintaining the project out of a sense of obligation, out of a sense of this is my identity. I am this person. I have to do this. How can I let all these people down? But I think if you've reached that point, you're running on fumes, and it's a matter of time before something's going to gotta give.
I look at John Rizek, who wrote jQuery, and I idolize him because at the peak of jQuery's thing, he's like, you know what? I want to do something else. It's just that type of discipline and that type of, hey, I'm going to leave while I'm on top. I've always idolized him for that. And I guess he knows like the secret to life, because it took me 8 years to like finally go, okay, I'm done. I used to have Google alerts and F5 bots and whatever. Send me everything that's Bootstrap CDN. I have to go on Stack Overflow and answer this question. There was one time where someone was having an issue with a certain class in a Bootstrap file. I created a custom one for him on the CDN. That's how fanatic I was. And then like I just got to it. I'm just like, I can't do it anymore. I got deflated. So John Rizek and you and a bunch of other people walking away and basically just handing over the baton to the next. That's what the beauty of open source is. You hand it over to the next generation or the next maintainer, and you go on throughout your merry way. And that's what this podcast and this organization is about, sustainability.
Nolan, do you think it would have been different if you were funded?
In my open source projects, I've always kind of run away from funding just because I always wanted it to be something kind of pure. I don't know, maybe it's this strange ideology I have. It's kind of purist sensibility that I want this to be something where it's a labor of love and not getting paid for it. But I think you're right that in a lot of ways that can help with sustainability. But I definitely think it changes the nature of the project. So I've seen how open source projects are built inside of big companies, for instance. And I think that the process is just very different from how it's built on the open. And it's not necessarily good or bad. And it probably is more sustainable. I don't know if it would have changed much for me, actually, because I did not want money at all for what I was doing. It almost felt like it would have dirtied it somehow. If you give a gift to a family member and they offer you money in exchange, it's kind of gross, right? That's kind of how it would have felt like for me.
So what are you doing now? What are you doing for work?
Well, in terms of open source, so I actually sort of had a rebound relationship after PouchDB that is ongoing. Maybe it helped me actually separate from that project. I got really interested in Mastodon around 2017, which is essentially an open source version of Twitter. It's federated, so you can spawn your own clients and have them talk to each other. I just really fell in love with the project. Thought it was really fascinating. And I got super involved in that. And to this day, I'm maintaining a Mastodon client called Pinafore. And as a part of that, I've also done some little offshoot projects. Like I wrote my own emoji picker for some reason because I didn't like the way every other JavaScript web-based emoji picker worked. And so even though it was a super crowded field and there were like 100 of these on NPM, I was like, I'm going to write my own. And I think I've been doing these kind of things in a more sustainable way than I used to because my focus is different. Like I'm doing it because I'm genuinely interested in the subject matter, in the domain space, and I'm scratching an itch. I'm also trying to make sure that I'm not making everyone else's problem my problem, nor am I doing it just for the reputational benefits. So this is, again, getting kind of personal. But another thing that I stopped doing around 2017 was, at the time I was super into Twitter. Like a lot of people, it's super easy to get like really invested in your follower count and you see that number go up, like you just get that dopamine hit. Everything feels really good. When you see those retweets, everything feels good. And I found that that would influence the way I'd write open source. So at the time, I would write a lot of kind of one-off projects where I'd like have some idea. I would like just make this project in the weekend and I would announce it on Twitter. And like I would get 50 retweets, 100 retweets, maybe front page of Hacker News. I feel so good, right? And then I'd realize, oh wait, now I've adopted a puppy. And suddenly there's like 20 issues being filed on it. There's all these problems. I didn't write enough tests. Like you can't do that every single weekend and have it be sustainable. So nowadays, if I have an idea for a little project, I try to think more of the dog that I'm going to have to feed every day than the puppy that it is in the beginning. There's a lot of ideas I've had where I haven't implemented them. The emoji picker is one exception. It's the exception because I decided to just I spent 2 months on it. I basically finished the thing. I spelled out in the README exactly what I was not going to do. I very clearly articulated all the non-goals and I put it out there and it is what it is. Like I haven't gone out there and tried to chase a lot of fame around it. I just kind of made a couple of very quiet blog posts around it. I also quit Twitter around 2017. This is not something that I would advise that everyone needs to do necessarily, but I think it was the right thing for me at the time. It was becoming too much of an addiction to the cloud, to the fame, to the influence. And I think for me, it was the right thing to just kind of step away from that as well. And I definitely paid for it. Like I don't get as much attention on my blog posts anymore. I don't get invited to as many conferences. And I'm just kind of okay with that. That's fine. There was a period in my life when I was super into that whole ecosystem. And now I'm just kind of not about that anymore. I'm trying to just tinker on my little things and make stuff that makes me happy. The Mastodon client I work on right now, Pin4, one of my major motivations for working on it is that my wife uses it. She likes using Mastodon and it's her favorite client. And so I call it wife-driven development.
Oh my God. Quote that. Yes.
That's amazing.
I love it.
I totally feel you on the adopting a puppy. And also it applies to other fields. As you said, Nadia said in her book, I had a project where I was in Bali where I put a thing up within 4 hours on Hacker News called The User is Drunk. And people started paying me money to get drunk and do UX testing. And 2 weeks into that, I'm like, I don't want to drink anymore, but I have clients. And now I don't even drink, but I still feel the need to go out and make small, splashy projects a lot because that got so much. It's, oh yeah, I should do that again. People love it when you make small, splashy projects, Richard, instead of maybe long-term, what do I actually want to do type things, right? So that's another excellent tension to notice and play with. Wife-driven development, though, that's a new one. I haven't heard that. WDD.
WDD. I love it.
I know that we're wrapping up here, but I just want to put out an observation. Nolan, it's very rare that you find somebody who's so self-aware and vulnerable and publicly vulnerable as you have been. The topics that we've discussed, we've never discussed on any of our episodes before. And the vulnerability that you've shown, and actually to me, I feel like you represent the majority. Ego and the desire to continue to build our career based off of popularity and based off of that is something that we all want, like all of us want. And to me, I would think that maybe guilt might be associated with that, like guilt for feeling this way. And I look at you and I could only imagine how much you had to really put yourself out there and just say, this is me. Like you just stepped out naked in front of everybody and said, this is me. And I just want to really put an exclamation mark on that point in that you have really shown what probably the majority of open source maintainers feel, but nobody talks about. So this is important. What you've done is important. The fact that you're happy is important. The fact that you quit working on that project, all of this is super important. It's important that you talked about it. So I just personally want to thank you because we have a lot of favorite episodes, but I think this is probably one of the most important episodes that we've recorded.
There is life after open source, ladies and gentlemen. That's what it is.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate that. It's valuable for me to know that I'm not just kind of navel gazing and just talking about myself for the sake of talking about myself. I talk about this stuff because I hope that I can reach other people who are in similar situations and maybe they don't feel like there's any way out of it. They're stuck or they can't even quite put a finger on why they're motivated to do something because nobody talks about it, right? And I think that we're just at the beginnings of figuring this stuff out. There's a quote in Nadia's book from, I think, from one of the people on Instagram, something like, we're in a pre-Newtonian moment with social media. We know that it works, but we don't know why it works. And I think that there's more in common between things like GitHub, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all these things, Instagram, that people realize. And we're just now in that moment of figuring out like why people are doing things out in the open, out in the commons, why people are putting themselves out there. And it's hard. I think we're going to learn a lot in the next few years.
It's to get those green squares. That's what it's all about.
I gave away my GitHub shirt. They used to have the streak on it. I used to wear that thing with pride. Now it's like, yeah, I'm good.
Yeah.
Nolan, where can people find you on the internet?
They can find me at nolanlawson.com. That's my blog. They can find that post there as well. They search for open source maintainer on there. And they can also find me on Mastodon. I'm at toot.cafe/@Nolan.
Toot Cafe. Awesome. Thank you so much. It's time to quickly do Spotlight before we wrap up the show. Spotlight is where we talk about projects that have given us a leg up or that need more light upon them. Justin Dorfman, what do you have for us today?
What I have for you today is this little open source business intelligence suite, not a suite, but program called Metabase. And Eric is who introduced it to me at first. And now I'm becoming kind of like a master. Like I have this like really great dashboard that I'm building out, and it just gives you a really good insight quickly into what you need to focus on. And if you're looking for a business intelligence platform, check out Metabase. They're really good.
Thank you. Eric Berry.
I found this project, which is extremely well maintained, but it has very few stars. I found it interesting that this project that's so important to me, that was started years ago, is still being actively maintained by one person. And it's extremely valuable to me. It's well documented. It's called Parametric, and it's at GitHub/ISMASAN/Parametric. And it's just a way to create data objects and structures and all of that. But I just want to point out that this is a really cool project. It's created by Ismail Celis, I believe, Celas. And just one of those things. I don't think that he cares if anybody else uses it, but it's an extremely well-documented, well-produced, a well-maintained project.
Thank you. I want to give a shout out to IPFS. They were incredibly helpful in bootstrapping my career. It's an awesome decentralized P2P platform. And, you shouldn't talk about your ex-girlfriends afterwards, but I just feel like, why not? And Nolan, what do you got?
My spotlight is fake-indexeddb, which is a project that I work a lot with IndexeDB still, even though I don't work with PouchDB anymore, which is IndexeDB is a client-side database in the browser. And what fake-indexeddb does is it's essentially just an in-memory implementation of it. Is especially useful for using your tests. So I really believe strongly in writing a lot of tests and having them run in CI. And so this project is just invaluable to me. And it's so accurate. It passes the IndexeDB test suite from the W3C better than some browsers even. It's well maintained. There's still activity on the project going on. It works really well. And I just wanted to give a shout out to it because it would be very difficult to do the kind of stuff I like to do with browsers if this project didn't exist.
Nolan Lawson, formerly attention-driven development, now test-driven development, aspiring wife-driven development. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. Great talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Thanks, Nolan.
Yeah, thank you.